Hello and welcome along to another session episode of In Conservation With. My name is David Lindo. I'm also known as the Urban Birder. And today I am joined by a man who's written a really interesting book. He goes by the name of Jaap the Roode. And I know that I haven't pronounced his surname properly, but I'm assured that it's kind of near enough. Um,
hmm
and before we before we start asking Yap about himself, let me just quickly say that In Conservation With is co-sponsored by Cower Sporting Optics, who are the makers of the very beautiful Promenade series of telescopes, and Birds, Wildlife, and Nature. Yeah, Birds, Nature, Wildlife, and Nature tours, who are um, they run tours across the world, showing people loads of really interesting wildlife and birds. So they're our sponsors, and thank you very much. So, In Conservation With, by the way, for those new, is a series of Zoom interviews conducted by myself and with people who are movers and shakers in the world of conservation. And they may not necessarily be conservationists. There might be someone outside of the realm that's come in with an interesting book or thought or whatever. But you'll find a whole stack of In Conservation With interviews, which started by the way in 2020 um, online on my YouTube channel, which is called The Urban Birder World. So check that out. And if you're watching this from YouTube, please tell all your friends about this. Get them to like and subscribe, and you do it as well. We need to get people to know about this. We need to get people to actually understand that there's so much information on this channel for you to disseminate. So, Yap, how are you and where are you?
Thanks, David. Thanks for having me. I'm good. I'm in Atlanta, Georgia, and so I'm 5 hours behind you. And yeah, looking forward to the conversation.
I, for some reason, thought you were in the Netherlands.
Well,
And
I'm from the Netherlands originally, but I've lived here in Atlanta, Georgia since 2005.
yeah, funny enough, I was in Atlanta last year. I should have looked you up if I'd have known. I
hmm
was given a talk for I think the Atlanta Audubon Society or something.
Okay. Yep.
So
Nice.
now, yeah, you've written this really interesting book, Doctors by Nature. Um, but let's hear about you yourself. I mean, you're a biologist, but when did you first realize that you had an interest? And by the way, excuse my glasses, I broke them literally this morning. So it could actually catch on though. It could be a new style, I think.
Got
Um,
it.
when did you actually discover your interest in the natural world?
I think at a really young age, I was really always into animals. It's actually funny because we never had any pets at my house because my sister and I had a lot of allergies. So we had a few goldfish and that was it. But we went to petting zoos a lot, and my mom was actually a tour guide in the local zoo in Rotterdam, where I grew up near Rotterdam. And so I spent a lot of time going with her and just looking at all the animals. I read a lot of books on animals. I became a ranger with the World Wildlife Fund a little bit later on. And then, yeah, so then after high school, I did a degree in biology in the Netherlands. But yeah, at an early age, I just loved reading about animals, and now I like writing about them.
Well, that's for sure. And how did you sort of start working within the realms of biology?
So when I first went to university, I decided to do a biology degree. I actually had two main interests when I was in high school. I loved biology and I loved art. But my school counselor and my parents thought that you wouldn't make money in art. So they kind of pushed me toward the sciences. And then biology was the logical choice because I always loved biology. And so, yeah, then I did my degree and I started doing research as part of my bachelor's and master's degree. And then I also started uh, having an interest in science journalism. So I took a course in popularizing of the sciences. I did an internship at a magazine. So at that point, I became interested both in the research side as well as writing about biology as well.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that seems to have led you to write this book is the fact that you've studied monarch butterflies and you studied the parasites that they
Hmm.
had. Now, very basic and maybe stupid question, but I understand that insects have um, other insects that eat them or what have you, but I never really thought of insects having parasites as such.
Hmm.
How does that work with the with the monarchs?
Yeah. So, you mentioned the monarchs and the parasites, and that's actually, I study monarchs because they become sick. That's what I like to tell people. I actually did my PhD research on malaria parasites in mice and mosquitoes, and then moved to monarch butterflies because I was really interested in studying parasites in a host that I could look at in the lab as well as in the field and really try to understand. But you're right, insects have parasites, and a lot of people know it without knowing it, maybe, because, when we think about diseases such as malaria or yellow fever or dengue, they're all transmitted by mosquitoes, right? Mosquitoes are insects, and we tend to think of those as flying syringes. They take a blood meal from one patient, take the parasites or the virus to another patient, and that's it. Don't really often think about them as the actual host, but they suffer from these parasites as well. And so mosquitoes are there, but pretty much every insect that is out there has some form of parasites, whether it's viruses, bacteria, fungi, protozoans, worms, all sorts. Basically, whatever we get, they get as well.
Do parasites have parasites?
Oh yeah, they do.
I mean,
There's
how far does it go back?
Oh, that's a great question. So there's definitely, when you think about insects having parasites, and then their parasites can have bacteria or viruses. Viruses is as small as it gets, but bacteria could have viruses inside them. So you could really have all sorts of interesting layers.
And again, I want to kind of go right back to the basics because I want to understand because I'm a lay person. I'm not a scientist at all, even though I went to the Dominican Republic in July last year and I went to a bird conference and I was one of the keynote speakers and I was able to hang out with some prominent, distinguished ornithologists, all with long grey beards and over the age of 90. And they said to me individually and collectively, despite the fact you haven't got the bullshit papers, that's what they told me. This is a quote, by the way. You are a scientist because you ask a lot of why questions. And I was like,
Mhm.
it's really, it really built me up after that. But the thing is, I need to know the basics. Okay, let's start with diseases and stuff that you talked about, malaria and stuff. Why do diseases exist in the first place?
Well, they exist because the organisms that cause disease have been selected for just as any other organism, right? So when we think about birds, why do birds exist? And I choose that because I know you love birds. Why do they exist? They exist because they evolved, right? So there were ancestors of birds, and some of them left more offspring than others. So they are the ones that are still around, and they left more offspring, and that's how it goes with evolution. It's the same with parasites. So yeah, rather than eating seeds or eating insects like a lot of birds do, parasites eat tissues of other organisms. And, if they do that successfully, they will leave offspring that do the same. And so they are maintained, and that's how they evolve. So it's not like they have any specific function or are there for any particular reason. When we think about everything that lives, it's here because it arose and then it evolved and it adapted to its circumstances and it persisted. And so that's whether you make a living eating lettuce or eating the liver of another organism, such as a fish, it's resources. And if you do it well, you leave offspring. And so that's why they exist.
That's interesting. Two things actually first sprang to mind. The first thing is that today I saw on Facebook there's a group in America, of course, that claim that birds are not real. Shy. Anyway, that's one thing I just wanted to say. The other thing is, so these parasites in effect are predators.
What is a predator? What is a parasite? So in ecology, we call them natural enemies. generally speaking, we define parasites as organisms that eat a bit of their host at a time, whereas predators generally have to kill their host and eat the whole thing. Um, and predators can eat multiple hosts. Parasites usually just eat one. So it's all a matter of definition. But what matters is that they both need the tissue of their prey or host to survive and reproduce.
Okay, I think that
And
makes.
I had heard about that thing about birds not being real has been around for a long time.
I
I
mean, it doesn't make sense.
it's just the same kind of thing as the Earth being flat and weird conspiracy theories. I don't know. It's very strange.
So it's in your book, Doctors by Nature, which I'm sure you got a copy of in front of you somewhere. Um,
Here it is. Yeah.
there you go, guys. Get out and buy that. Um, you talk about obviously the possibility or the probability of animals self-medicating, which we'll talk about in a second in more detail. But medicating means
Mm.
taking something different to into your system to make you feel better. So what what is the definition of medicine? What kind of medicines are there?
It's that's a really tough question. And I actually struggled with that when I was writing the book. And I actually had a whole chapter on this question, what is medicine? And together with my editor, we decided that it didn't go anywhere, so we cut it from the book. Medicine is really hard to define, right? So I use the term medication rather than medicine. So when we think of medicine, it includes so many things. It includes drugs slash medicines. It includes surgery. It includes vaccination, right? So when we think about modern medicine, but then if you talk to Chinese traditional medicinal people, then they'll tell you, drinking green tea is a form of medicine. Yoga is a form of medicine, right? So those things are also by some included in the word medicine. And so basically everyone has a different definition of medicine. Now, medication, which is the term I adopted in the book, is more about using medicines or drugs to cure yourself of disease, to improve your health. And so when you define that, it becomes a lot easier to deal with and to define it and to write a book about. And it's also when we think about medication, that is the one thing that when you look across all the different medicines around the world, that is what they have in common. So whether it's traditional Chinese medicine, whether it's Ayurvedic medicine, whether it's modern Western medicine, it all involves drugs, right? Drugs or medicines. I use those terms interchangeably. And so that is what they all have in common. But, so we have a lot of evidence that animals use medicines, drugs, so they medicate. There's a lot less evidence that they use vaccination or surgery and things like that. So I really try to focus on the use of drugs.
And do you think that the drugs that we have, all the drugs we have that cover a plethora of different ailments, have they all got a natural equivalent, do you think? Do you think that somewhere along the line someone's taking or something is taking a drug because it's got a headache, for example?
Yeah, so in fact, most of the drugs we use come from the natural world. So, even these days, I think that over 40% of new drugs that hit the market are still derived from plants. And so, the plant world is so full of chemicals that we can use for all sorts of things that oftentimes we don't have to design things from scratch. We can either use what is there or adapt what is there by changing the scientific formulas somewhat to make them better, more effective, have less side effects. And, I think a great example is aspirin. And, aspirin, we tend to think this is that wonder pharmaceutical drug. Most of us have probably used it at least once in our life. It is a tiny little white pill that comes from a box. But where does it originally come from? It comes from willow trees. And so it's actually bears who first discovered the healing properties of the salicylic acid that is the foundation of aspirin. Because when they're in their hibernation, they come out of hibernation, they're completely inflamed. And one of the first things they do is eat the bark of willow trees that is loaded with this chemical and that reduces their inflammation. And then people around the world copied that behavior and actually started using this as well. And then much later, several hundred years ago, people rediscovered it, isolated the chemicals, and then later the pharmaceutical industry optimized the formula. But at the end of the day, it came from nature and it was discovered by animals first.
You know, it's really fascinating you're talking about bears because you just don't think of a bear arousing from hibernation, having a backache, or, his joints are a bit stiff. You just don't think that because you think of them as being superhuman. I remember, well, not superhuman, but just super. I remember as a kid
So
watching,
animals.
I remember as a kid watching an animation cartoon where the main character used to say size of a, and then you'll change into an animal like an ant or whatever to escape wherever he, or whatever
Uh-huh.
predicament he was in. And I thought for a long time, I'd love to have that superpower, turn into a peregrine so I can fly off quickly if I'm in trouble. But then I realized, thinking about it, you wouldn't have the instincts, So if you became a bear, you went to sleep for, because you decided I want to sleep out winter. I don't want to, I don't want to face winter, for example. You wake up with all these aches and pains which you never would have expected to have had.
Yeah, it's funny. On the one hand, we look at animals and think they're super animals because why wouldn't they hurt? I don't know about you, but as I get older, getting out of bed in the morning now actually hurts, right? And
Yeah.
that's like after 7 hours.
Yeah,
So
I make noises that I used to make at night during the day now.
yeah, there's all sorts of creaking and all sorts of things. But yeah, when you think about it, it's not actually that weird that they would be in pain, right? I mean, it's months that are they're basically laying still in a cave or in a burrow. And but it's interesting that we tend to think, just because they can do it, that they must be perfect at it, right? It's like a bear looking at us and saying, "Wow, sitting at a desk all day, how can they do that without pain?" But it's actually not good for us. So I don't know. But on the other hand, we look at animals and think they're not very clever, and that's where partly this book came from, is this idea that a lot of people still think that animals just are not as smart as humans. And of course, for a long time, we thought, well, they don't have language like us, they don't have culture like us, they cannot use tools as us, they cannot use medicine like us. And then actually they have that, right? So I always find it curious that we think of animals as being super natural or super animal in some ways, but at the same time, we also think they're stupid.
Yeah, we tend to sort of be very selective in our thoughts towards
Mhm.
other animals. Now, I did actually, excuse me, raise this with you prior to pressing the record button, but I look around me. I mean, I'm a naturalist. I'm out looking at wildlife all the time, and I think to myself, I don't ever or very rarely see an animal which I think is clearly sick.
Mhm.
And if so, surely there'll be, natural selection and all that stuff. They'll be sort of gone in 5 minutes. I mean, I watch a lot of these things on Facebook when they show lions chasing after,
Mhm.
zebras, and basically that you assume that they're catching the oldest one or there's some problem with it. You can't tell, but it seems like you're more likely to be falling victim if you are unwell.
Yeah.
So, well, if you are unwell, then how can you, what's the point of medicating because you're going to be dead? I mean, I don't understand how, I mean, this is completely alien to me in many respects in terms of the idea that a mammal will medicate, or we think they may medicate when in reality they could be dead in the next half an hour once they've fallen ill.
Yeah, but it's all the more reason to medicate, right? If the cost of infection is so high that you have a high chance of mortality, then there's also very strong selection to find ways to prevent that infection or to take care of it when you have it, right? And it's absolutely right that a lot of animals that are sick are more selected by predators. They're easier to catch, and that's true. But oftentimes, animals, before they get that sick, they still have a chance of fighting the infection, and they can do that with medicines. There's also a lot of diseases that are there that you won't see, right? So a lot of birds have all sorts of blood parasites, and a lot of them have really low levels, so you may not notice it. But if they have high enough infections, you probably wouldn't see the bird because it died somewhere. So that is possible too. But there's also this idea that you saw this, for example, with primates, that non-human primates, that when HIV essentially jumped from non-human primates to humans and became really virulent in humans, the idea was, well, it doesn't cause any disease in wild chimpanzees or sooty mangabees, but people just didn't study it. Once you study it, you actually find that they are sick. I was talking to this with Mike Huffman, who did a lot of work on chimpanzees and was really the first to describe animal medication scientifically. And when he first suggested that this chimpanzee he was following was using medication, a lot of his colleagues said chimpanzees don't get sick. And it's not true. Once you look for it, you see it. So that's another thing.
So give us some examples of how, for example, chimpanzees would medicate.
Yeah, so like I said, so Mike Hoffman is a primatologist who was at Kyoto University, and he actually worked together with a park ranger from Tanzania National Parks named Mohammadi Saifu Kalunde, and he was also a traditional healer, Mohammadi. So it's really interesting couple of people to study these chimpanzees, and they were following chimpanzees in Tanzania. And they were studying the role of older chimpanzees in chimpanzee societies. They weren't looking for medication at all, but they were following a particular chimpanzee called Chausiku and noticed that she wasn't behaving normally. She seemed really kind of tired. She seemed sick. She had very dark urine. She was defecating, lying on her side, which is not normal behavior. And then they witnessed her going to a plant that she didn't normally eat. They saw her stripping the bark of the branches and then sucking the inner parts. And that plant is called Vernonia, known by Mohammadi as bitter leaf in their local communities, and it's used medicinally by the people there. And so they saw this very elaborate process where the chimpanzee was sucking the bitter pith of this plant, and then because it was a medicinal plant in local communities, that's when Hoffman thought, oh, maybe she's using it as medicine. And so then the next day they went back and saw that she recovered. So she recovered in 24 hours. And that was similar to what humans recover with when they use this medicine as well. And the follow-up study showed that the plant had chemicals that kill parasitic worms, that chimpanzees do this behavior when they have worms. So it all started to make sense. So that's one way, eating toxic plants that kill worms. Another really common thing that chimpanzees do is that they swallow the leaves of plants. And so this was actually observed by Jane Goodall and other primatologists much earlier, where they often found the fecal pellets of the chimpanzees that had whole leaves stuck in them, not digested. It's like complete leaves. And the question was always why they're doing this. Well, it turns out that what they do is they find leaves that are very hairy, that have a lot of these rough hairs on them. It's like Velcro. And then they fold them over and they swallow them. And what that does, it does two things. On the one hand, it basically scrapes parasites off the guts. And so the parasites get stuck. These are worms that get stuck on the hairs. And also it kind of irritates the bowel so that you get kind of this diarrhea that purges the worms as well. So that's another way in which chimpanzees do it.
It's amazing.
Mhm.
And do they help each other? I mean, do
Yes. Yeah. So there is more recent work that actually showed that, and this is still, the researchers are still figuring out exactly what's going on, but there are particular chimpanzee groups that when they have wounds, they grab little insects from the air, and then mix them with their saliva and rub it in their own wounds. And so this is probably related to wound repair and wound healing or anti-infection properties. And they do that to each other as well. So rather than smearing this in their own wounds, they will do it to each other as well.
wow. So, I mean, we're talking about wild animals, but I've noticed with dogs, and you've got two lovely dogs, by the
Hmm.
way.
Yeah, here's one.
And I
The other
love
one, yeah, my feet. So yeah, there's one.
uh,
This is Cooper.
beautiful dog. They eat grass.
Hmm.
Um, is that for medicinal purposes, or is that just because they just want to eat grass?
Yeah, so it's one of those things that a lot of dog owners have seen their dogs do, eating grass. A lot of dog owners don't like it. I actually spent a lot of time with my other dog who is sleeping across the room there at a dog park when we first had him, trying to socialize him. And I noticed that as soon as other owners' dogs started eating grass or dirt or wood chips, they go like, "Oh, don't do this, don't do this." And it's actually interesting. There's very little scientific research on grass eating in dogs, and but there is way more observations and research on wild animals, carnivores. So that includes mountain lions, it includes lynxes, and it includes wolves. And you often find that they eat grass. And you often find that when they do that, you find the grass in the feces together with parasitic worms. And oftentimes these animals use grass that even goats don't want to eat. Now we know goats are supposedly eating anything, including tin cans, which is not actually true, but that's kind of the metaphor. But so they go for really rough grass. So it's very similar to what we mentioned with the chimpanzees, that what they seem to be doing is they eat grass, it's rough surfaces, it irritates their gut. It irritates their stomach, so either throw up or it irritates their gut, so they purge parasites and other things from their guts using these grasses. And so they use it in that same way as kind of a parasitic purge.
And it makes me think about where did this all come from in the very beginning? I guess it's the same with humans, working out what mushrooms to eat, for example. I guess it's trial and error through
Mhm.
evolutionary, you know, line of their development.
Yeah, and this is something that, we don't have a great understanding of in many systems at the moment. I think one really great example comes from an insect called the woolly bear caterpillar. So this is a caterpillar that, a lot of people would call it a fuzzy wuzzy. And so this caterpillar gets attacked by these really, I mean, I'm a parasitologist, the really beautiful, amazing parasitoid flies. And what these flies do is they lay eggs on top of the caterpillar, and sometimes lay an egg inside. And then the maggot comes out and goes inside the caterpillar, eats it up from the inside out, leaves the caterpillar alive long enough until it's ready to pupate. And then it comes out and kills the caterpillar in its wake. So, kind of like the alien creature from the movie. And like I said, if you're a parasitologist, that's great. If you're anyone else, that's just gross, right? And so these particular caterpillars, they can eat a lot of different plants, but when they are infected with these flies, they start consuming more chemicals called alkaloids. And why do they do that? So there's great study that showed that these caterpillars have four taste receptors, and one of them specifically tastes alkaloids. And when they are infected, these taste receptors start firing at a higher rate to the nerve cells. And so it basically tells the caterpillar, this is good, keep on eating this. This tastes really good. And so it's a very innate mechanism with that taste receptor that allows the caterpillar to do this medication, right? So it doesn't have to know what it's doing. It doesn't even have to learn. It doesn't have to make associations. It's just, it's sick and its body tells it, when you're eating this, keep on eating it. And I think a lot of behaviors that we see are based on that. And even we have those things, right? When we are sick, we suddenly crave things we normally don't crave, such as chicken soup, for example, or we really don't want to eat things or drink things that we normally love. And it's the same for pregnant people. They have amazing cravings and aversions that they're not thinking about. It's just their body's telling them you need this right now. And so I think that's where a lot of this medicinal behavior comes from.
That's really interesting you say that because when you mentioned about humans, I suddenly realized I remember when I sometimes have a bad stomach, I reach for a can of Coke instantly, even though I don't normally drink Coke.
Right.
I don't know why I do it even. It just kind of makes me think this is good for me, so do it kind of things.
Mhm. Yeah. And to some extent, that's also conditioning, right? And associations. When I was a kid and I felt sick, my parents would give me Coke. I don't know where that comes from, but so, so I kind of learned that. I don't know if I would have discovered that myself, but for a lot of things, and certainly for animals out in the wild, they they have these cravings and then they start tasting different things and they may actually prefer to keep on eating particular things. A lot of medicines, for example, a lot of medicinal plants are bitter. And so a lot of animals actually start preferring eating bitter things when they are sick. And so that is one way in which they can tell this is a medicinal substance that I need.
Yeah, because when I used to have a bad throat, my mum used to give me this really horrible cough medicine. It was so horrible that just one sip and I felt better straight away because I didn't want to drink any more.
Right. And that's another thing, when we talked earlier, how do you define medicine? And I said, well, I don't know, but I can define medication. And this is an important thing about using medication, using drugs or medicines, is that they have side effects, right? It's usually stuff you wouldn't normally eat or normally drink because it doesn't taste good or it's actually really harmful. When we think about human drugs, they have all sorts of side effects. And that's true for the drugs that animals use as well. So too many of those alkaloids for those caterpillars, not good for them. Too much of that bitter leaf that the chimpanzee eat will actually kill them because it's so toxic.
I don't, I'm sure you can't answer this question, but I just can't imagine a caterpillar or cricket or whatever being sick, like the same way I would be sick or you'd be sick.
Yeah, but they are. Imagine that those maggots eating your insides. You would feel that. That wouldn't feel good.
Yeah, but you would do, I suppose. Yeah, but I'm just thinking about, you're a caterpillar, you're a millipede, and you just feel under the weather today.
Hmm.
It's
Yeah.
just a concept we just for me, in the natural world, it's more like a life or death. You can't, you don't seem to have an illness that lasts a day or two. It's life or death half the
Mm.
time.
Yeah, but then when we look at our pets, right, we're more willing to see it, because if you have a dog or a cat, there's days it's like, oh, they don't seem to be feeling well today, right? And then we take them to the vet. And so, yeah, I think we just don't know the signs as well for a lot of wild animals, especially insects.
Yeah. Speaking of insects, social insects like bees and wasps and ants, um,
Hmm.
they must have some sort of colonial use for medicine.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's really intriguing. And again, we're talking about insects, but this is really something of the last few decades that people have actually accepted that insects can use medication because before that, and especially based on the studies in chimpanzees and other mammals, the idea was you need to have these big brains, you need to know what you're doing. Now we're learning that that is not the case at all. Like, for example, with the caterpillar that I explained. But yeah, so social insects. So there's really wonderful studies on wood ants. So these are ants, for example, that live in the Jura Mountains. And what they do is they incorporate little pieces of resin. So resin is the sticky stuff that you find on trees. And they take it to their nest and put it in there. And what that does, it reduces all sorts of infections with fungi and bacteria and viruses. And honeybees do the same thing. And that's a really interesting thing as well, because honeybees, what they do is also collect that same resin and then they mix it with the wax that they make themselves to make a substance called propolis. And this is interesting. This propolis has been used by humans as a medicinal substance for very, very long time. But somehow people couldn't, get to the point that maybe bees use it for the same reason. And so until recently, people say, I don't know what that stuff is. It's just annoying. And but yeah, what the bees do, they coat their walls of their colony with it, and it keeps viruses out, bacteria out. It's even bad for the mites that suck their tissues out of them and transmit viruses. And but what is interesting is that because it's really annoying for beekeepers to use, because you think about a wild bee in the hollow tree, there's like a rough substances, and so they fill it up with this propolis and make it beautiful and smooth. And so now we put them in boxes with smooth planks, and there's nowhere to put that propolis except in the corners. And so that means it's hard to take the lid off, hard to get to the honey, hard to do your maintenance of your bee colony. And so actually beekeepers have selected against it, or they remove the propolis whenever they can. I've talked to people who said, when you take a beekeeping course, the first thing they tell you is how to remove the propolis because it's so annoying. So we've taken that medicine away, right? And now we have all sorts of problems in the bees that are probably likely because of that, all the viruses and bacteria infections that we see. Um, but then there's ways to bring it back, and that's cool too, because you could just have planks that are not as smooth. You can make grooves in them. The bees will fill it up, and they're back to medicating their colony. And yeah, that's cool.
It seems to be for me, my brain. I find it sometimes it's almost like merges the difference, the similarity or whatever between medicating and preventative treatment.
Mm, absolutely. Yeah. And that's a tough one, right? So when we talk about animal medication, we distinguish therapeutic medication. So that's the medication you use when you are already sick. And so you take medicine in response versus prophylactic medication. That is preventative, right? So that's when you eat particular things or plants or compounds that will help you in the future. And that's actually much harder to demonstrate, right? So when you do experiments, it's much more easy to show that an animal responds to infection by using medicine. But when you see an animal using something that has medicinal properties, to then prove that it will prevent things in the future is a lot harder. But we see this with those social insects that we just mentioned, the bees and the ants. A lot of that is preventative. So, and what is interesting though is that for those ants, they put that resin in their nest, but they put a lot more in when they have babies. So during the season when they produce brood, that is when they put more in. So that really kind of goes with the idea of this is preventative measures to keep viruses and bacteria away from our developing babies.
What about our aquatic friends like the fish and
Yeah,
frogs?
that's such a great question. We know very little about them. So we have pretty much all the examples in my book are from terrestrial animals. And that's not because there won't be any medication under the water level. I'm sure there is a lot. There's a lot of beautiful toxins in marine environments. You know, you think about all sorts of toxic animals and corals and sponges and plants that I'm sure aquatic and marine animals are also using medication. It's just that we haven't studied it very much. The only example right now that I can think of is on dolphins, and that is still, we don't know for sure yet, but dolphins in the Red Sea, they rub themselves against sponges and corals that then release large amounts of antimicrobials, which they may use against skin infections. That hasn't been proven yet. So, but it's an interesting hypothesis that needs further study.
Yeah, very interesting. And obviously, not obviously, but there is inter-taxa stuff going on as well. For example, birds like crows and other small birds using ants to spray
Yeah.
formic acids onto their
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, that's called anting, which is it's really fun. So there's a lot of birds, like you said, that either, passively go and sit in an ant's nest and they get formic acid sprayed all over them, or they actually do active anting where they grab ants and rub it into their feathers. And birds can also ant with other things, such as cigarettes or plants or all sorts of things. So we now use that ant as a verb for things that don't involve ants as well. Surprisingly, though, there is very little research to support what that actually does. So, very few studies have shown that it really helps against parasites. So, there's alternative hypotheses for why they do it that may have to do with feather maintenance or stinking them up or itch relief, all sorts of things. It's not very, very clear. I think some clearer examples come from lemurs and capuchin monkeys that use millipedes in a similar way. So millipedes have beautiful toxins that they use to scare away predators. And these monkeys and lemurs will happily grab these millipedes, bite them in pieces. So the millipedes ooze all these toxic liquids, and then they rub it into their fur, and it keeps all sorts of mosquitoes away. But that also could have a social function as well, where they just love doing it as well together. But that has been shown to have anti-mosquito effects. So that could be one case where they don't use plants, but they use another animal. That's right.
That's interesting. In the previous in conservation with, oh, look at him. The person I was talking to was talking about caracadas, who are related to falcons, and there was one particular species found in Suriname that actually brings millipedes into its nest,
Right. Yeah.
sort of nips it, so this stuff oozes out,
Yeah.
and apparently keeps all the parasites at bay. So it's one of one thing that if you do have a choice, do not come back as a millipede because everyone seems to be wanting to use you for some reason.
Yeah. Well, but it's the same with plants, right? So you think about all these beautiful medicines that plants produce. They don't produce it for the benefit of animals or the benefit of our medicinal practices, right? They have evolved it to keep herbivores away. Plants cannot walk, which is a big issue for them. So they have all sorts of other defenses. And one of the most important ones is all these toxic chemicals that kill all sorts of herbivores or deter the herbivores, but then a lot of animals take advantage of it. So yeah, they didn't evolve it for our benefit, but it just so happened.
But with birds, are there, I mean, again, I would imagine crows would be the genus, the family that would be sort of doing that, sort of self-medicating the most, or at least
Mm.
probably the most studied. But do you think it's something that happens across the bird world, or
Absolutely, yeah, yeah. So I don't actually know of any crow studies. Crows are often used, very well used for studies on tools, how they create and use tools and how there is all sorts of cultural transmission of specific tools, which is amazing. But for birds, most bird studies have been done. So, for example, starlings are a good example. They collect a lot of different green leaves and parts of plants and put them in their nests, and that is a way of fumigating their nest, keeps these blood-sucking parasites away. The best example comes from house sparrows and house finches. There have been beautiful studies in Mexico City where researchers have found that the house sparrows and the house finches there, they incorporate cigarette butts that people, they smoke their cigarette, discard the cigarette butts on the floor, and then the birds put those in their nests, and that keeps all sorts of bloodsuckers away, including ticks and lice. And that's actually a really well-studied system. It wasn't just the observations. They did beautiful experiments where they actually, created artificial nests and then either added live ticks that can suck the blood of the chicks or dead ticks that obviously cannot suck anymore. And they find that when you add the live ticks, the birds start collecting more of these cigarette butts and putting them in their nests, and that helps their chicks. So that's really the best example we have.
just amazing how these birds just realize that? I mean, that's
Mhm.
learned behavior, which is fairly recent, isn't it?
Yeah, so when you think about, of course, house sparrows and house finches are really good at adapting to living in cities, right? And so, they nest in all sorts of places in our buildings. They're very happy there. And, wild birds will collect all these different plants that have all these aromatic chemicals that stink up their nest and keep parasites away. But these birds have discovered that the cigarette butts do the same job. And, also when you look at those birds, so when you see where they nest, and there's tons of nests on the same building, that not every bird has to invent it for themselves. They can learn from each other as well, and that's true for for the chimpanzees as well, that swallow leaves. They can learn from each other. So it doesn't take that many animals to come up with a new way of medication. Other animals will copy it and benefit from it that way.
I know you've been studying this for some time, and obviously part of this study's resulted in the book. But how long have humans known about this? How long have has this been talked about in Aristotle's day or even before?
Oh yeah, so Aristotle actually wrote about dogs and eating grass and said it was for to get rid of parasites. Um, so there's also evidence from Ötzi the snowman, that's several thousand years old, that was found in a glacier in the Alps in Europe, and he carried medicinal mushrooms with him. And then more recently, people have looked at the fossils of Neanderthals that are tens of thousands of years old. And then it's actually amazing because you can look at the teeth and you know how we get our plaque and that turns into calculus. And that traps all sorts of things, including bacteria and chemicals from plants and everything. And so doing analyses on the fossilized calculus of Neanderthal teeth, they found that it includes chemicals from medicinal plants, and that includes yarrow and chamomile, that are plants that are used medicinally all around the world, but never used as food. And so that means that these Neanderthals were most likely using that as medicine as well. So that's tens of thousands of years ago. But you can go further back, so you look at chimpanzees. chimpanzees and humans share their last common ancestors some 5 million years ago. So probably 5 million years ago, humans were doing it already too. So, given that animals all around the animal kingdom do it, I think humans have used medicine for as long as we have called ourselves humans, or maybe not ourselves, but for as long as we refer to fossils as humans.
And what about the future? I mean, the more I look at the world, the more I realize, and we all do, that, it's under threat.
Mm.
Certain people who want to cut down forests, all that sort of stuff. Um, and obviously, we're losing a lot of things before we even get to know about it. Do you think that that's going to be a major detrimental thing for mankind, if we lose these discoveries before we
Mhm.
have a chance to discover them?
Yeah, I certainly think so. I think, traditional healers and shamans have looked at animals for thousands of years to come up with all sorts of medicinal treatments using herbs, but also, like we said earlier, aspirin came from that as well. I think, I'm a biologist and I'm a nature lover. So for me, it's obvious that we should try to protect it. But I think that, there's this argument to be made that when you look at nature, you look at the whole plant kingdom, that's all potential medicines there. But then on top of that, we have all these wild pharmacists and doctors that are using these medicines, and we can learn from them, right? So from that point of view, from a medicinal point of view, you could say, by protecting nature, we're also protecting the sources of the medicines, but also the knowledge that all the other animals have that can point us at the medicines that we want to discover.
So outside of the lab, how do you enjoy nature? What do you do?
I love hiking, especially with my dogs. But yes, I love hiking, but I also love building my pollinator garden. So in addition to my research, I'm also on the board of the Rosalind Carter Butterfly Trail. So this was a nonprofit organization that was started by the late former First Lady, Miss Rosalind Carter. And I got involved in that, very lucky to get involved in that. But yeah, we're trying to really encourage people to recreate habitat for wild pollinators, and that includes monarch butterflies, but it includes bees, beetles, all sorts of midges, whatever. And really with the idea that, sometimes when you think about the things we're doing to nature, you feel powerless, right? There's so little you can do, but then there's little things we can do. And one of the most shocking things that I realized too in writing this book is that thinking about green lawns, people's front yards, why do they have to have this green lawn? And you count it up, actually, the green lawns that we have are a bigger crop than corn in the United States, which is incredible. The amount of lawn is bigger than the Netherlands, where I'm from. And if you just, as an individual, replace even just 10% of it with wild plants to regrow the native habitat, we can save so many plants, so many insects, so many other animals, and even also provide benefits to our own pets that can go in there and frolic around and get some of the chemicals they need to keep them healthy. So that's another way. I love putting my fingers in the dirt and growing these gardens.
Yeah, and it's one of the messages we try to put out in the UK, certainly, which is, if you got a garden, just put 1 square foot aside, because that 1 square foot aside as a wild area is a veritable jungle to a
Hmm.
cricket
Yeah,
or
and
a
yeah,
hummingbird.
and you may think it's not very much, but if everyone does it, it adds up to a lot of habitat.
Yeah, it creates a mosaic of habitat, a corridor,
Mhm.
so
Yeah.
it's incredible. I mean, I think your book, um, you know, is an important book, really. I think people, I mean, do you find that the average person, I mean, I guess I was one of those people that I spoke to you, the average person is living their lives totally unaware of this whole concept that animals can potentially self-medicate.
I think so, and I think that's why I wanted to write the book. And it's not just that they're unaware. I think some people are even in denial, right? But I think by embracing that animals have this knowledge that a lot of us usually ascribe to just humans, but just giving animals the credit that they deserve, that they're very good at maintaining their own health, and that we may even learn from them. Yeah, that's definitely important for me and a big reason to write the book.
I noticed that you got a massive caveat right in the very beginning of the book, which is not to go out there and repeat what you've read on yourself, which is, I guess, a very important thing to say, isn't it?
Yeah, there are because we talk about medicine, and like we said earlier, when you think about taking drugs and medicines, they have side effects, right? So it's really the dose that makes the drug. So, you take coffee, for example, right? So a small amount of caffeine can be, good for you and increase your alertness and make you more awake. But too much caffeine can kill you, right? And it's like that with every medicine. So yeah, if you look, to cure your pets, still go and see that vet because you don't want to do damage.
And are we talking about domestic animals, which we very rarely, if ever, do on In Conservation with?
Mhm.
Do we treat our pets like we treat ourselves? And that is, it's almost a badge of honor to be taking drugs, prescribed drugs. I get that feeling, especially in America, that when I speak to people, yeah, I'm on this drug, that drug, this drug. I took that drug for this. A lot of people taking drugs. Are they doing the same for their animals?
I think the issue with animals is that they are encountering a lot of the same issues that people are facing. So a lot of diseases related to inflammation that go back to having not enough movement and eating too much or unhealthy food. So there's a lot of talk now about, getting dogs on more natural foods, right? Because a lot of the kibble that is used is very highly processed. And so similar to the highly processed food that humans use, it's full of, byproducts of that processing that are really not very healthy and also lacking in some substances that would help against inflammation. So a lot of the issues that our pets are facing are very similar to the issues that humans are facing. And so I think that's where the idea comes in that, if we let them have more varied, healthier diets with some choices, then they'll be better off than if we just, feed them these standardized diets the same every day, don't give them enough exercise and so on.
Is there one particular instance of potential self-medication in the animal kingdom that really surprised you when you're researching this book?
I think, the cigarette butts was really surprising and exciting to me because it seems so counterintuitive to use something that is so bad, right? Because we know smoking is bad and there's all sorts of side effects to smoking, and that's true for the birds as well. When they use it, actually causes some problems in their blood cells as well. So again, it goes with this idea, you need to use medicine at the right dose. So I think that was probably the most surprising thing. I guess the other really surprising thing for me was the fact that we used to know so much and then let go of it all, right? So go back to the traditional healers that have looked at animals. They have looked at elephants and porcupines and all sorts of other animals to come up with medicinal treatments. And that really blew my mind as well.
Fantastic. Um, what is your next project? I know this book obviously has been a major thing. How long did it take you to write it, by the way?
It took about 1.5 years to write it. And then there was the editing and everything. Yeah, yeah. It's exciting, but yeah, I'm working on my next book now, and that is going to be about co-evolution, and that's all going to be about trying to explain things that we take for granted but just don't make any sense. So think about why can plants kill us? That makes no sense. Why can a little newt kill 25,000 mice? And that's all because it evolved such high levels because it had to counteract the defenses of the predators. That goes all the way to why do we have such big brains? And that all goes back to the evolutionary battle between the sexes. So that's going to be the next project.
Yeah, well, just one question on that next project. I don't know if you cover this question, but I've always wondered the bee orchid, who came first, the bee orchid or the bee?
Yeah, it's like the chicken and the egg. Um, their ancestors came first, right? So, you know, so they both started off, their ancestors were much more generic, right? There were flowers and there were bees. and then you get, mutations occur and you get divergence. So the plant starts being different, and only some of the bees will still be able to evolve with it, and they start evolving in tandem. So, and that's a different evolutionary path than other bees and other orchids that have evolved. So their ancestors came first. That's all I can say.
Yeah, can't ever. So, yeah, because how can I'm just wondering if the bee was guided by the appearance of the orchid as opposed to the other way around, because how could the orchid see the bee?
Again, it started off with way more generic flowers and bees, and then it went into these different directions. Yeah.
Well, listen, I think your book is actually it's great. It's really thought-provoking. I think that you should basically try and get yourself um I'm talking about people watching this, get yourself a copy of Doctors by Nature, because I think that it's a subject that, I mean, it's a mainstream book, so it's a subject that's going to be accessible to a lot of people, and I think it's going to open a lot of people's eyes. Um, and I hope that it allows people to think about the world in a different way, because we often are so, we have this such a sort of superior attitude to other life forms. We are the be all and end all, even though, as you
Mhm.
say,
Yeah.
really a lot of in fact, all of our medicines have stemmed from nature, you know.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
yeah. Well, listen, Yap, I thank you for spending an hour chatting with me about your really interesting book. And it could be a good idea now to just flash it up.
Sure. Yeah, and thanks again, David. It was so great talking to you. Thanks so much for having me, and really pleasure to talk about this topic.
No, it's been great. And all I can say now is that I'd like to thank the Zoomers, by the way, who turned up today to watch it live. But if you are watching this in the future, as I said, please like and subscribe. Tell all your friends and even a few of your enemies. Get everyone to watch In Conservation with. And until we meet again, keep on looking up.